Well, good morning. I think we're about ready to start. Before we get started, David Williams has a book that he'd like all of you to sign, America in Space, not Canada in Space, but America in Space, and the book is out here at the desk, and he would like all the participants to sign the book for him. So if you all would do that before you leave. But we're going to start off in a little different order than we have in the program. We're going to start off with Group B, and then we'll do B, C, D, and then come back and do A later. So I'll turn it over to Group B.
All right, I apologize for the delay there. Our group that we had yesterday was quite sizable, and if you looked at the schedule, you'll notice that there are probably about 38 or 39 people that were listed for that. We probably ended up with somewhere around 22 or 23, and it's a very sizable group to have to try to work some kind of consensus from. And secondly, and I don't know if everyone was provided with this, but I'm going to show you you don't have to try to read anything, but those are the list of topics that we were supposed to actually cover. There's probably some 20 of those on there that had to be covered, and somewhat reduced to a point where we could actually make some cogent statements about it. So we took on a slightly different strategy in order to have that happen. And what we did is we divided our group into 4 groups. And each group took a quarter of these topics to deal with, and dealt with them in the context of 4 cross-cutting questions that they all carried with them and kept that in the background of their mind as they were trying to work their way through. And the questions were essentially, what's the current status, and what are the needs or the gaps that exist for what we want to do in the future? And secondly is, what are the efficiencies that we can gain by proposing or working an international strategy to those subjects that were listed on the page of 20? And then thirdly, what are the barriers that we currently are confronting in order to try to secure those gaps? And then fourthly, in our great wisdom, what can we tell you of what we think the world, according to us, should be? And those are really summarized in one word: what were our recommendations? And so that's how we approached this problem. The section that we had was called, I think it was Data and Research Resources, is what it was called. So like the first section that we dealt with was the current data and historical data, all dealing with data. The second section had to do with the venues in which we conduct space research, largely in orbit research rather than just the preliminary and things that are on the ground. So that's Mir and ISS, and what we might think about lunar stays and what we could be doing, or what recommendations we could make for the lunar stays. The third group looked at our capabilities and looked at the capabilities post 2010 and 2015. Also including in that, wherever necessary, wherever appropriate, the Mars Viking data and knowledge capture that's taken place, Lunar Apollo program and what we learned from that, and the Mars mission, or planned Mars missions. And that was a big job. That was headed up by John Charles. I don't think he's here today. He did that part, the first part on the data. Oh, like I said, hi, John. The first part on current data, Kathy Johnson graciously agreed to do that, and then on the Mir and the facilities, Professor Petrov very kindly agreed to lead that section, and so we had a very exuberant discussion. I happened to place myself in that one. And so enjoyable exchange that we had. And the last 4 or 5 things had to do with ground-based, like cooperative research opportunities and what we could recall from the experience on Skylab that might be of general use to everyone. So are we on the regular schedule, Mr. Abbey, for about how long for this? for these summaries. They were originally 30 minutes, and I don't want to. Okay, so someone watched the clock because I didn't know where I started. So in looking at data, it's very, very interesting. I'm not going to go through, this is about 25 pages long. It'll be made available to anybody who wants it. Right? I think will it become part of the disk? So you'll have this eventually available to you, and you can see it. They went through the types of data that we have, and some of the things that are problems in the current status and what we really need. And I think that if I had to summarize what the message was, and Kathy, you can help me here if need be here, is that we have a lot of data. It's in a lot of different places. And this is not speaking just to NASA. We're talking now internationally. It's in a lot of different places. It's in a lot of different forms. Like some of this could be published data. Some of it is operational data that's archived in various places, various countries. And so it's quite diversely deployed. And so the question here came about is obviously, how can we refine this system? How can we improve it? How can we make it so that for the real easy public data, the ones that don't have legal ties to them, like for instance attributable data on clinical histories on individuals and things like that, not included necessarily, but how can we make this really useful data accessible? And so we have some ideas about that, and a lot of recommendations. It involves new policy. It's going to involve new agreements. So I think the expectation is if you really want to achieve this and do it in such a way that we can actually have a chance to understand the full body of what our knowledge is, and so we don't have to rerun some rabbit trails that we've gone in the past. And as we're getting older in this agency, and I know for NASA, a lot of our corporate memory is attriting here, and so we have a chance of losing that if we don't track it really well, because there's a sorry situation of not knowing the history. You have a tendency to relive it, and that might be good for some of the good things in history, but some of the mistakes we don't want to relive. So the recommendations have to do with specifically with about the formulation of policies and agreements. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because in another section we actually thought that there ought to be a central tracking mechanism for it. In other words, not a repository as such. You can't get all of this data and pull it together, all the publications. You may not be able to get those actually in one location. But if you have a centralized tracking process, a website that actually links out to where all of these various things are that you could actually search, and this would be either by subscription, but it's a secure site, for the use by the partners. And that might be a plausible way to approach this. There are probably plenty of people in the IT business who can tell me that I'm full of it, and so that's open for conjecture and for debate. So, but those are the kinds of things that we see. On the data side of things, obviously with attributable data, there's always going to be some challenges in working attributable data. I think we can probably parse that data in certain ways for certain kinds of attributable data that can be rendered non-attributable and be not necessarily into the deep personal life of the crew members and still allow us an opportunity to use that knowledge for how we work managing the risks in the future for human health in space. So that basically, I think, and Kathy, tell me if I missed anything, summarizes the data side of the world. And it's not sufficient. Is that what we're saying here? I mentioned about policy changes that are going to have to be there in export control. It's obviously one of the things that our nation has to work on, and how we're going to manage that particular law. And I think the way it's applied currently, obviously, it's very, very constricting to confining to what we want to do. So I would say the expectation is that we're going to either see if certain factors, certain functions can be waived in this, and or whether the law needs to be redesigned to help us be able to act as a nation in a world that's trying to collaborate on a big adventure.
one other key point was the importance of standardization of the testing.
Okay, they want you to speak into a microphone, but there's no, oh, here.
Repeat it back for them.
Repeat the question and then they're.
You can just repeat the question.
Sorry about that. One of the other key points was to make sure that we standardize what we're collecting so we actually have comparable data that could be pooled together.
Yes, and that's true. The standardization challenge, if you will, and we find this true when we're just trying to review research data on very basic things. Even I found myself personally, when you go across the spectrum of all the different papers that have been published from the different sources, different countries, we have different bases upon which we do these experiments. Sometimes it's very, very hard to do comparisons without a standardization. So I think that the standardization part of this is not a trivial challenge for a whole bunch of reasons. Culturally, we're different, and sometimes also scientists have a tendency to say, you know, it's my way is the best way. And, you know, I know my experiments, I did them the best way, and others are not necessarily done the best way. So we have to really kind of transcend that and find ways to at least have, for a specific key set of activities, standards that we can follow and make it so that these data are not only comparable, but they're compatible, okay, and complementary, so that we don't have to nearly do as many experiments as we were planning to do necessarily, if we can fit the pieces together from each of what is done in all the various partners' research programs. So with that, I'll go to looking at the platforms. We looked at the platforms and really stuck closely to the areas of research that are covered as medical, biological, psychological, radiation, and environmental, and looking in the context of that. Well, trying to say what is the current status of the data from MIR is not easy. The reason being is it's got that scattered characteristic that I mentioned earlier. So what we were talking about in the context of data itself alone would apply to trying to understand the full experience of MIR. And so one of the things in the current status that we ought to try to get a better understanding is how much of the equipment, because a lot of us built flight equipment, and some of it was flying and some remained on board MIR when it was deorbited, but a lot of that flight equipment was also paired up on the ground and ready as backup equipment or equipment we switched out on a periodic basis. How much of that equipment is available to us? Because given the current state of budgets for building new equipment, if it's functional and if it meets the scientific needs, we ought to be able to access it. So one of our recommendations are that we actually get a reasonable review of what that is. I think that I think one of the other things that came out of the discussion that probably ought to be on the floor here is that we feel that there needs to be a more recognized interaction amongst the medical groups of the various partners with regard to the exchange of the data and the kinds of findings, kinds of experiments that were done on MIR. And I think that would help us, all of us, in working towards setting standards for healthcare in our crew, and secondly, for getting a shorter pathway to mitigating some of these risks. We could spend a lot of time doing a lot of research, and I think if we had a better understanding of what was the foundation that we're working from, I think it would probably help us a lot. We see a lot of efficiencies coming out of this. I think that there is a certain, sense of satisfaction amongst us as international partners when we have joint results that are significant, something that makes a difference for all of us. And so I think that helps also with another aspect that we all struggle with, which we call small n. Okay? The small numbers of subjects that we have, the small numbers of observations. And we're having difficulty struggling with what kinds of statistical analyses can we actually apply to these and be reasonably assured that the probability numbers that we're getting from that are giving us a true picture. So we can't be without that. So that's what we looked at in the context of MIR. I think one of the more stronger points that Professor Petrov made was that we really ought to look at a forum in which we could do that. And the books exist already. That there's a fairly large compendium of the research results and the clinical results from MIR. But I think that, as is true for most publications today, this is what worked. Okay, this is because you're not allowed. We don't get the privilege of publishing negative data very often. And so there are a lot of things that didn't work, and there are a lot of things and a lot of lessons that can be learned from that experience that we ought not forget. And so, and I thought that was an excellent suggestion. I'm not sure. By the way, we dealt with what as far as the problem. Everything we looked at was in the context of the interrogative what. Where, who, when, and how. Okay. Or others, and it's for another forum, because that's an enormous amount of time to see if you can get that kind of an implementation plan in place that would actually be worth investing in. So, all right, and the barriers, obviously, one of the problems is we have is getting a clear statement of the mutual benefit, and I think we can do that, but I don't think that it really is well stated and out front in our international effort to say exactly what the mutual benefit is, how we're all better off from having done that. We do have some professional, cultural obstacles, okay, and that means the culture of a profession, not cultural meaning nationality. But we do, and medicine sees things differently than the engineers, than the scientists and the crew. We all have differences in how we see how we're going to handle this kind of an approach. And so I think we need to get something that's vectorial from that allows us to be able to approach this and get a meaningful plan on the table that could actually be done. So we looked at ISS also, and this, the song for ISS is going to be the same for a while. Okay, and it's got fairly restricted utilization right now. We're building the building, and in building the building, it's sometimes very difficult to conduct inside that structure what it was originally being built for. We're facing that, and we're facing also the sunsetting of the shuttle. So, but as an example for us to follow, I can tell you Russia, in talking with Dr. Petrov, has at least 150 projects on the table for their segment between now and 2015. And so we have to look at ways in which we can maximize our opportunities for up mass and down mass. We've got to look for ways that we can subvert our need necessarily for down mass for virtually almost all the experiments that we do. This means in situ analyses, sending back ones and zeros instead of pounds and metric tons. So I think that you can see that we understand what the status is, and we know what the challenges are. Needs, there was a unanimous feeling that the Crew 6 is really, really an important issue. It's an important issue for two reasons. Obviously, the opportunity to have crew time, allocated for research, but moreover, it also gets the N up on the subjects, and we can begin to have a better opportunity for some of the data that we think is critical to understanding these risks and being able to go ahead and do things about those risks. So, yes, sir.
Did you look at or talk about logistically how are you going to do the research on space station?
We talked about transportation. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, because
Yeah.
logistically, from an EVA standpoint, an experiment standpoint, it's going to be difficult to do without the shuttle.
Yes, and I don't think there's anyone in this room that thinks that there's a clear pathway to a solution on this. Obviously, we're going to take every advantage we can to have experiments that are compatible with the current transportation, the planned transportation to ISS in these cargo vehicles. And that's going to be quite limited because the conditioning is not the same as it would be in the shuttle. And so just transportation alone, and particularly down mass, is almost fairyland. There's a small amount of down mass that we can get in the Soyuz, but that's got to be well coordinated. And it's got to be very small. It's got to be safe. It can't be just, you can't bring back things that are potentially hazardous. And so it's a very restricted environment. Now, I'll tell you another discussion that came up since you brought it, is that we feel that we need to make widely known that there is a market out there to get to the station. It's in Europe and in Russia and in the United States. And the market is actually much larger than we had thought. We're only beginning to see it right now. And so there's a real desire for transportation. Whether that market force is going to be sufficient enough to drive the commercial development side for transportation to the station is something time will only tell us. And it may not be 20 years for us to know that, and it may be in a few years we'll know what the feasibility is. We won't know when they're going to have it, but we'll at least know the feasibility as to whether or not some of these people can do it. The market forces are actually larger than we had thought. We now know there's a consortium that was formed out in the West Coast just very recently. Not with NASA. It's totally independent. Academic institution, several biotech companies, a major medical foundation, some VC people, venture capital type folks, have gotten together, and they want to develop this working group in Southern California to be able to purchase transportation to the space station to conduct research for commercial development purposes. Okay? Commercial development, largely commercial biotech. Those are realities that are taking place. There's more than one of those planned, and they may do several places in the United States depending on the kind of response that they get. But I see that as a market force that tells the commercial developers for transportation that there is a future in this. And I think if we expand the concept to understand worldwide where all the pressures are for that, we may stand a better chance of getting an organized investment into the development of commercial transportation. And I'll get off of that soapbox because there are some rooms within our organization that think that I actually smoke something in order to be able to say that kind of stuff. But 6 months ago, there were no agreements. There were no MOUs. There was nothing that we could see as a real driver except the fact that the opportunity is really good. It's rife. The time is correct, and we probably ought to see if that opportunity can be realized. Well, the NIH signed an agreement with us with regard to doing research. And critical to that agreement was that the International Space Station be a national laboratory for the United States, the U.S. segment. I think this is good for all of us. It's good for us internationally because it's additional pressure for us as a country to have some kind of transportation to this venue. Thursday we will meet with the NIH again, and there will be a discussion with regard to the process for how grants might be released and how we will participate. NASA probably will not do any science merit and not determine what science at all goes up there. Okay, it will be determined only from the practicality of what you can fly, and NASA's role in that will be just to assess that and provide the necessary guidance for the NIH to do this. This may end up as a released proposal within the next 12 months or 14 months. I'm saying may. So I'm very encouraged, and I'm only telling you these things because I don't want you to think that I live in fairyland. These are real. The USDA, the Department of Agriculture, has already constructed their MOU with NASA. It has gone through the entire USDA legal system and their leadership, and it's now on the desks of people at NASA in legal and in the administrator's office to see if we can do that. We're working another one we're trying to do with NIST, and we'll probably do several other agencies as time goes on. And I think that you can see that as their interest grows in using the microgravity tool, the microgravity microscope, to look at these life processes, there's going to be increasingly more pressure from within the federal government, from the commercial sector, and from the academic communities that may lead to the kinds of changes that we need for our accessibility up there. All right, so that's kind of where we were with Space Station. With regard to lunar stays, an interesting thing evolved here, and perhaps it's because of my own naivete or even just ignorance with regard to this. But when we looked at the status of this, there's no formal agreement or commitment from anyone other than the U.S. as to what we would do with regard to the moon. And in fact, it's kind of interesting to find out that some of the governments are not enamored at all with the idea of participating or going to the moon or spending resources to go to the moon. So that poses, I think, a fairly substantial barrier to how we're going to go ahead and do this in the future. And I wish I could tell you that I had really exciting suggestions about that. But basically, if you had to summarize our recommendation, it's, do that, okay? We need to go ahead and go forward and see if we can put together the kind of program that has a trade basis to it that will entice the governments of some of our partners to actually go ahead and participate with us in the moon for things that we will do together later on another thing, another project. So it's going to take some creativity to get there, but that's where we were with the lunar stays. I'm almost done here, Mr.
Neil, I have a quick question, if I can, yes. Because I think it'll come out in our international agreements thing. We're sort of diametrically opposite to where you came with your comment just now, because you make it sound as if NASA is interested in partnering with people. Our impression was they have given no indication that they were interested in partnering with anybody going back to the moon. So that may be a problem with why you are not finding other nations that are willing to come on board. The comment we made yesterday was, this was a unilateral effort and we would seek partners as we needed them.
I understand that that's been said in the past, but I thought that our center director said on the first, in his presentation here and another presentation that I heard, that the anticipation was that ultimately we would be an international effort for the long stays on the moon. I think that the sorties are probably rather unilateral. I think. Now, and I'm really open to correction on all of that, but that's what came out in our section, and I can understand that if we're looking at just the short-term missions, that it's probably going to look very U.S. Okay? But the longer term, I suspect we would be looking for partners in that regard. Okay, lastly, here we're going to get on to couple of things here very quickly. The ground-based cooperative research activities, there's a lot of information exchange that went on with regard to this, and they're looking at obviously the mission support for this, the flight analogs that we have, the basic research hole, if you will, the gap that we've got with regard to basic research with regard to within NASA more so than the partnering agencies, and what to do in the entire scenario of pre, in, and post-flight. Set common goals, I think, was one of the things that came out fairly clearly there. Standardization, again, was a subject that came up as suggested before. So I don't want to repeat all these things. The barriers are still the same, export control on down, and it's always money. Budget's always a barrier. And actually, we look at these things and we scratch our heads about why we have to make trades for this for that inside a given activity that we want to do. But the whole system is dimensioned by money. It's an agreed amount of money that you're going to have to be able to do something. And so within that package, if you're not spending the money to do one thing, then you can do it for another. Or if you want to do something that's not in the original concept of the package, there's something else that you're not going to do. And so those things will remain as I don't really want to call those barriers. Those are challenges, and it's different than a barrier. A barrier sometimes means it's almost insurmountable. I think these are things that we can actually, with new technologies and things, we can surmount a lot of those kinds of problems. So from that came a flow chart of how we might develop a consensus policy for exploration of human related research. And I'm not going to give you this. It's one, it's one of these kinds of things. It's a flow chart we're going from here to there. And fortunately, this one here does not have more arrows than blocks. Those are the ones that drive me nuts. You got more arrows than blocks. That means you go any way you want. So, okay. And lastly, when we looked at the capabilities 2015, 2010. The biggest problem, again, is obviously transportation. I think that one of the things that's really a concern in the 2010 timeframe is that we've got to do something about the down mass side of this. And you basically have two choices. You either have to get transportation that can haul it back, or alternatively, you need to put in place analyses. So you do real-time analyses and send back data. And I think that the latter is going to become more and more likely. And there are two reasons for that. I think it's actually cheaper, believe it or not, because with new technologies emerging, we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller in our analytical capabilities and more exquisite and actually more accurate in a lot of these things. And so with that, I think that that probably we're looking more likely sending back a lot more data than we are stuff. Now, there are certain things you're going to need to have back. So barriers that you see there, we have right now we have a population of people really married to the idea they got to have their stuff back, and so I think that's one thing we got to redo. The crew time access ostensibly is going to be somewhat resolved by the addition of new crew members. Now, you get more people up there, there's still more things to do to take care of the place where they're living. So it's not like if you're going to get two more crew, that you're necessarily going to get two more people full-time to do research. So please don't get it, that idea. The recommendations, I think, and this is to actually look more at the ISS and the ISS opportunity as how you can prepare for long-duration things on the moon. What kinds of equipment can you validate? What kind of processes can you validate? Obviously, in the ISS, you're not doing surface exploration, but everything non-surface exploration related could be could be validated and worked there. So those are the major recommendations. There's more verbiage here about a lot of different aspects of it that ought to be considered. I'll make available. But if you have any more questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. And I noticed I said the word try. And I want to thank the leads, Earl Ferguson, Kathy did this, Dr. Petroff, and John Charles. And they actually, they were redacting this and pulling it together. I got some as late as 11:30 last night. We were still working on it. So it's a very quick deal here. It's certainly a draft. Thank you. Okay.
We could go ahead with focus or the next group C.
Hi, I'm Greg Olson. I was asked to be the group leader of the education focus group. I have my summary on the email. I actually emailed the results to Leroy, and I think he's going to distribute it to everybody. I'd just like to call out the members of our panel. I'm wondering if you quickly raise your hand as I call your name. George Abbey, of course, everyone knows. Laura Barger. Jean Becker. Okay, Steve Conlin. Okay. Edna Fiedler. And Kevin Falk. Kevin? Yeah, that's okay. Dennis Heeden. Nick Canas. Ann Kennedy. Okay, David Longnecker. Marlene McLeish. Okay. Sarah Lynn Mark. Charles Oman. Carolyn Randolph. Don Thomas. And Bill Thompson. There we go. Okay. With education, it's easy to define the issues and the problems, and it's even easy to propose solutions. The difficulty is implementing them, and that's what we found is the real problem here. This is a topic that's been debated for a long time, but how do you really do something about it? So I thought I'd list the issues, the problems, and what solutions we came up with, and also ask the audience at the end to, what ideas you have that we might include. I go around giving space talks to kids, trying to get them interested in science and engineering. And even though it's mostly an American effort, I've done it in a number of places overseas, Japan, China, South Africa. I tell them the three most important words: don't give up. I mean, that's true for school, it's true for everything we do. So in spite of the difficulties, I'm going to follow my own advice and not give up, and try and summarize the finding of our group and tell you something about the interesting comments that were made, and then again, I'm going to solicit more inputs. For the issues that we came up with, first is a global battle for science and engineering talent. This is, I tend to focus on the American side of it, but this is all around the world. Just this weekend in the New York Times, there was an article about how in Japan they can't find Japanese engineers anymore, and they have to import them. And I mean, this is a problem we've been dealing with for years in America, and it seems to be becoming an international, global problem. Math and science performance in general is declining in most Western countries. Asia obviously is a notable exception here, but most Western nations, it's going down. And this affects not only the space program, but all technical fields, energy, medicine, everything we're involved in. And there's also similar issues in the humanities, reading, writing, history. I mean, how good can you be at math if you can't even read the problem that you're supposed to solve? So, it all goes together. Those are some of the issues we focused on. As far as problems, we mentioned generally poorer scores in math and science across the board. And one thing that was agreed upon in our panel is that students in K through 8, kindergarten through 8th grade, get very little science during their 8 years. That was a bit of a surprise to me, but apparently that's regarded as accurate. Another problem is, certainly it's true in America, and I think we're exporting this problem, that kids want to get rich now. They want the easy way, they want to be millionaires when they're 25, and they don't want to work hard for it. And obviously to do science and math, you have to work a little harder. So, and one of the things that goes along with that is there's a lack of motivation to pursue technical careers. And something George Abbey mentioned, which is true, if we do come up with a solution, you have to remember this will take a decade at least to implement, probably longer. All right, if we do find the silver bullet that's going to solve this. So there's not going to be any quick fix here. Some of the recommendations we came up with is, first of all, focus on kindergarten through 8th grade. I personally believe if by 8th grade a young person is still struggling with his basics, it's just going to make it that much harder in high school and even university if he gets there. So get them while they're young. I mean, that's what I do with my science talks. I try and hit the, kids in the age kind of 7 to 13. Teachers, someone coined the phrase recruit, retain, and retrain. We had a number of people involved in education, and the feeling, I think, was unanimous in our group that the issue is with teaching. If you get great, motivated teachers, everything will follow down from that. But that's the single most important thing to do, is to get the teaching at high level. Use space. This conference was about space medicine, is about space medicine. We should use space to get more kids into science and engineering. Use the NASA findings that exist. One of the biggest things we came up with was we should have a blockbuster type program. Go to Mars, get to Mars in 20 years. Energy independence in 20 years, something like this. If the nation came up with a blockbuster program, this could really fire the imagination of kids and get them more interested in technical careers. Just like many of us in the audience will fire it up by Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin's flight, and as well as the moon race. And finally, look at programs that have worked. I mean, this isn't totally negative. There are groups in Scotland, in Huntsville, Alabama. Certainly in China and India, they seem to be doing something right, because they don't seem to have this malaise the way we have it here with science and engineering. I know the brief week I spent in Beijing, they didn't need me there because it seemed like every Chinese kid just wanted to be a scientist or engineer. That was the hero thing to do. I'll finish up with some interesting thoughts and comments that the group had, and then I'm going to ask all you who had your hands raised to maybe comment a little bit further. One thing that was mentioned early was the 2004 National Academy of Science report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, is that the correct phrase? That apparently has looked at this issue in some detail and has a number of good recommendations. Comment was made that textbooks are dumbing down. That's an American expression. An example of that is books now have fewer or even no equations. So how can you talk about a technical subject without equations? But it's part of this reaching out. Most people that had experience in universities agreed that incoming skills are generally down. Again, Asian students were listed as an exception, but in general, the incoming skills are going down. It was mentioned that in Houston and in the state of Texas, less than 50% of the students graduate high school. I mean, that's a serious issue. And, those are some of the problems that are coming up. Additionally, suggestion was made to infuse NASA results into school curricula. I think that's already being done, but a lot of people felt that was a good thing, and we should do more of it. Comment was made about the wow factor. It's really hard to get kids excited today, certainly harder than when people like me were young and you had this race to the moon that was going on. Very interesting fact that was mentioned by someone, that apparently there's a very good correlation between NASA funding and the number of science degrees that are issued in the United States. And there's a year or so lag between the two, but if you look when NASA funding is up, generally science degrees go up too. So I think that's something we could learn from. It was mentioned that we need to create teacher-student incentives, rewards, bonuses, tax breaks for parents, who put their kids into a technical program. And finally, an issue was to endow chairs at universities. This means when someone puts up money for a professorship at a university, you can often have this oriented. It could be the chair of, further science education, or, it can be stipulated. So this would be another way of, increasing the number of students that go into science and engineering. That's all of my formal comments. Would anyone from our group like to issue things I've forgotten, or is there anyone whose name I didn't mention that participated in our group? I'm so sorry. Yeah, all right. Comments?
I would just add, one of the points that was brought up yesterday also included new ways of iterating information to the students. That is, in ways they're used to getting information from their peers. So become more IT savvy and in a more integrated approach when they have cell phones and iPods going off. And I think that way then that they can equate what they're doing in their normal life to how they're learning and gaining experience in the classroom. And I think that might be something to help facilitate their interest and garner enthusiasm.
Good point.
Yes, I'm not on the panel, that particular panel, but if I could make a comment.
Please.
In science, we encourage bold, innovative ideas that may not work, but it's something worth trying. And I'll tell you something that we're doing, and I'll tell you the experience that we've had in getting it going. The only way we could do this was to not tell the National Science Foundation that we were doing it. We got money for something, and now we're trying an experiment. It may work, it may not work, but anybody who's over 30 years old feels that it's going to fail. Everybody under 20 feels that it's the greatest idea in education. And it comes from a Finnish study where kids in Finland were blowing away everybody, all of their peers in the Western world, in science and math. And the way they were educating was to do 30 minutes of education and 30 minutes of play. 30 minutes of education and 30 minutes of play. And as the father of 4 children, I know how difficult it is to tie a child down for extended periods of time. Although I see that their ability with technical things is really extremely good. They can pick up little devices and really start flowing with these quite well. And so the experiment that we're trying, and remember, if you're over 30, you probably won't like it, is there's something called Dance Dance Revolution. And Dance Dance Revolution, you may have seen it in certain arcades where there's lights that come down with music and kids are moving their feet according to the pattern of lights that come down. And when I was a child, I remember learning to music, and we followed the bouncing ball, and we learned patterns, and it was really, really quite catchy. But when we came up with programs like that, my own children were embarrassed to have me go to the school because they said it was so boring. So what we've done is we've coupled with Dance Dance Revolution, and I've taken the 7th and 8th grade textbooks, because my findings is that's where we lose them, in that age group. If I go into an elementary school and I say, how many of you would like to be scientists? Half the class raises their hands. If I go into high schools and I say, how many people want to be scientists? You get a couple of people raising their hands, but very few. And so somehow we're losing them in that period. And so what happens is I've reduced each chapter in those textbooks to 10 bullet points. I take those and I give it to a professional composer, and he puts it to lyrics, and then it goes into DDR with the lights coming down, but the lyrics on the side. And the way DDR works, you have to watch the lights, so you can't watch the lyrics, but it's a social game. So everybody is watching you do it. They are watching the lyrics. So they see visually the lyrics as well as hearing them. And so we're trying bold experiments to see if we can have the release. Now the science teachers in the classrooms, and I think that number in Houston is, I may be wrong on that, but it's 50% in many of our schools are at risk of not graduating. So it's different than the not graduating, but maybe that number is right. But I believe it was 50% at risk. That's mostly what we're seeing in the Houston Independent School District. But the science teachers are really enjoying this because it gives them some way to let students have a physical release, yet it's underscoring the very concepts from their textbooks. And I would be excited about innovative techniques. I've gone to the National Science Foundation, I've gone to the Department of Education, and this is generally run by people who are much older, and it's very hard to get really, truly innovative techniques put in there because they say this is entertainment. And we have assessment. We have assessment in our programs, and we have the numbers. So as scientists, I'd certainly encourage that.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a comment as well, and this is a very, very complex area, so I'm not really sure whether my comment has any merit at all. It comes from the fact that 10 days after I landed on my last space flight, I was sitting there with my kids watching the NASA movie Roving Mars on Blu-ray. And for those of you who've had the full Blu-ray surround sound experience, this is quite an impressive experience. And at the end of watching Roving Mars, I looked at my kids and I said, wow, would you guys be interested in going to Mars? And they looked at me and said, we've already been there. We just experienced Mars. What's next? And, we're getting to the point where virtual reality is almost better than reality, and that people can experience the mysteries of exploring underwater without ever having to get up off their sofa. And it kind of makes you wonder, as we go down this road of technology and incorporating and embracing technology, whether or not the reality and the true personal experience of participating in these amazing things, whether it's working in a research laboratory doing science, or whether it's exploring different parts of the world in the solar system, whether reality is actually better than virtual reality. And that begs the next question that I spent a lot of time as an astronaut talking to kids. And now when I talk to kids, my message is not that I want 1,200 little astronaut clones and everybody's going to go out to be an astronaut. My message to them is to find where their dream is and to pursue their dream with passion and focus. And focus is not easy. It was not easy for me to become an astronaut, and I would be willing to bet that for everybody in this room, it's been very, very challenging for everyone here to have achieved what they've achieved in their career. So my message for kids is if it's easy to do, the joys of doing it are probably minimal. The great joys and the great passion and the great benefits come from challenging yourself to do something that's very, very hard to do. And to do something that's very hard to do requires learning focus, learning the discipline to sit down to do things when it's actually really boring to do, like memorizing the Krebs cycle for those biochemists in the room. I apologize, but I found that really boring to do. But, at some point, you have to do it. And I'll just finish by saying that, when I was training for my spacewalks, I did the big comparison of peak performance in different teams and things. And somebody comes up with this 3,000-hour rule, that if you want to even be competent to play with other people in that area of discipline, you got to put in 3,000 hours, whether it's driving racing cars, flying high-performance jets, golfing, doing et cetera, et cetera. And if you think about it, and I spent a fair amount of time talking to Eric Clapton about this, who I think is, he's a pretty cool musician. He spent months locking himself up in a room practicing 12 hours a day. So when I go and I talk to kids and they say, I want to be a rock musician, that's great, good. The same skills you need to be a competent rock musician are the same skills you need to be a competent biochemist, astronaut, et cetera, focus, discipline, and the ability to pursue your dreams and pursue it with passion.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yes, Kevin.
Thank you. So in the UK, we're in a slightly different position. Obviously, we're the only G8 nation without an astronaut program, which I've tried to explain to my government at length. We spent some time last year reviewing what it was and why it was we don't do this, what it was and how it was that we could sell it to government. In the end, government said, look, we don't really care about prestige. We don't really care about doing things for vision. Unfortunately, we have these policy promises and we want to know how you can help us meet them. And education in the end was the thing. Education, because our policy promises are that we have a knowledge-based economy we're trying to deliver with kids that don't know very much at the moment. And so they've been very taken, and it's been an argument that's played to Parliament quite well. I went before Select Committee last year, and education was the winner. The problem is very easy to state, as we heard. Everyone knows the problem. The problem is global almost. I think in a couple of sentences, genuinely what you're seeing is when you talk about India and China, you're seeing the pragmatism of emerging superpowers. And when you look at America and the UK and some of Europe, you're looking at the complacency of superpowers and former superpowers. And that makes it an incredibly hard nut to crack, because I think it's a cultural problem. And I think in that vein, you need to tackle it with tools of culture. That's what we came down to. Specific interventions are extremely hard to come up with here. We were amazed, actually, that there are no metrics of the effect of human spaceflight, or indeed space exploration in general, in the uptake of science in schools anywhere, particularly in the United States. The only evidence that we were able to find, and the evidence that Greg quoted about the correlation between NASA's budget and the uptake of science technical PhDs through 60s and 70s, was really hard to find, and I had to find the raw data on it and recreate it for last year's report. It was tough to find. You would have expected that to have been page 2 of NASA's Why We Do This website. Wasn't there. In terms of specific interventions then, the only thing that we could come up with was the chair endowment idea, and I think that as a proof of concept, because we can't at least encourage the UK to come up with a multi-billion-dollar program at this point saying it will work, because that's just not the way the UK works. And so to finish, the intervention that we proposed as a pilot study was the endowment of 3 chairs across what would be equivalent Ivy League universities in the UK. And those chairs would be space exploration associated chairs with a human spaceflight stance, because that's the new thing for us in the UK. And under those, you'd have 2 postdocs per chair, you'd have 2 PhDs per postdoc. So you'd basically have 6 postdocs, 3 chairs, 12 PhDs. The PhDs you would select, and you know that anyone who gets an undergraduate degree can do a PhD if you show them. So you would select those PhDs as a prestige selection. These people would basically be your rock star PhDs, and you would select them because you would know that they would be able to go and communicate what they were doing to, I don't know what your system is, K, whatever, primary school in the UK, we call it, it's a lot easier. That they could go and communicate. And on a Friday afternoon, you'd say, instead of pouring test tubes and hitting Excel spreadsheets, you're going to go out to this school and you're going to tell them what you do and why they want to be you in 10 years' time. We don't know if that'll work, but we can set up the metrics beforehand, and as George says, that'll be a decadal program. And at the end of 10 years, if it doesn't work, you can fold out of that.
Yeah. A related suggestion we had was for itinerant teachers. I had mentioned when I was young, I lived in a rural area, and the music teacher used to travel around from school to school, but he was very good. And if we could get really competent science teachers to go around, that might help a lot, instead of relying on teachers who may not have a scientific background, in fact, are afraid of the subject. Better to have someone that knows it well and can, really entertain the kids and get them worked up about it. Yes?
A couple thoughts here. The dropout rate probably is orbiting around 50%, but there's no uniform way of reporting data in this country. And the U.S. Department of Education is trying to figure out a way that each of the school districts and each of the states report data in a similar way. It's probably generally accepted that school systems such as Detroit are orbiting right around 25% of the entering ninth graders will actually complete within 4 to 5 years. It's probably orbiting in our metroplex here right about 54%, somewhere in there. But those are loose figures, and there is a need for uniformity. And that uniformity and demands for curricula needs to come from entrepreneurs, needs to come from major agencies, needs to come from all of us. And whenever we have an opportunity of speaking out and speaking loudly that science is good, math is good, more might be better, and have expectations that our school systems, K whatever, or primary through wherever it is in UK, is that we're all professionals and speak uniformly and loudly that we expect more from what we have. And it's surprising that in school systems across the country, if you test something, it gets done. If something is in a standard, for example, there's no standard for space education in the national science standards in the U.S., nor are they required in the state of Texas or in any state that I know of. So if we can put things into standards, into policy, and require that it be taught, it may make a difference.
If I could real quick, it's very interesting. We're sitting in a place where Kennedy basically said we're going to the moon. And with that, embedded it in the education system all the way down, where it enthused several people sitting in this room to actually do something about it. I'm very curious about the strategy of breaking down the silos of education and science and innovation and the crossover into it, because a lot of things, even in the UK, it's very siloed. When you try to go to the Minister of Education and actually sit there and say there's something in science that's valuable, we need to embed it from the top down as a strategy and have that champion sitting at the top, like Kennedy, basically saying, we're going to do this, and making it trickle down so that it affects everything. And it does take that 10 years, because it took us that long to get to the moon. Historically, look at that, and what are we doing to actually break down that barrier and to have that interaction and the champions sitting in there in government for us that are informed? Just curious if anyone would like to comment.
That's what I mentioned in the beginning about implementation. It's not being implemented. Yeah. I think he had his hand up first, but you next.
I want to return for a second to and applaud the suggestion here about Dance Dance Revolution as an example. I think I have some concern that this is the last group that ought to be trying to, we can identify the problem pretty effectively, but this is maybe the last group in terms of its average age that ought to be coming up with the solutions to it. And the example I wanted to use to follow up on that is something from actually within NASA. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but there are a group of 4 young NASA engineers who have put together a wonderful, I think it's about 60 PowerPoint slides, but you can do it in about 4 minutes. There's just a few words on each one. But it really says, where do you need to go to attract young scientists? And these are young scientist engineers from within NASA. And I'll give you just one example of it. They suggest, they said, we'll know where you're attaching to, for example, high school age kids when someone Twitters the high school students during an EVA. Well, I think it says they probably aren't working on gloves or haven't tried gloves on yet, but the concept there of that sort of connection with the student population is I think, a very, very essential one, and that's basically their message. Now, I've heard the term Twitter, and I have a vague idea of what it is, but I've never Twittered anybody. And very few of us, I suspect, here have. But that's the kind of thing that these young people are using for communication tools. And if we want to connect with them, we need to connect on their terms, not ours.
Good point. Oh, okay, go.
You know, I've gone out many times over the last 20 years and talked to students all around the world, really. And I have a couple of kids who've gone through our local school district, and this is what I've come to realize. You can have the best textbooks in the world, and you can do all sorts of manipulating the curriculum, but if you don't have a good teacher day in and day out, you're just not going to be successful. So you can have all these gimmicks, and you can have all these different approaches and different ways to present the material. But the fact is, if I go in and talk to these kids for an hour, they still have to sit with their science teacher day in and day out. And I mean, I'm embarrassed to say in our school district, in NASA's backyard, my kids have had horrible science teachers. And I don't think the problem stops when you get out of high school. My daughter's been through 2 years of college, and any interest she had in biology has been very successfully beat out of her, which is really a shame. I do think there's a cultural aspect of this problem, but I really think it is the quality of instruction and the passion with which that instruction is delivered that is the only solution, and the rest of the stuff is just little stopgap measures that might have little pockets of success, but certainly will not have programmatic and systematic success.
I think we were unanimous about that in the group. This gentleman? Oh, no, this gentleman's had his hand up for, thank you.
Did you mention, I didn't recall if you mentioned incentivizing families
Very briefly, but say a few words
one of the
about
things
it.
we talked about was another issue among all these others is that it's important to get the families involved, and that the familial, there's some cultural groups where the value of education is so important it really hits the kids so that they really do it. And one thought we had, whether the families were rich or poor, is to create some sort of incentive program where, for example, parents will get $5,000 a tax break or something if their kids major in a science or a math, and somehow give them money, rich or poor, to encourage their kids to go into areas that are targeted areas for nationally as being very important for the good of the country.
How are we doing on time? Anybody keeping time? All right, how about one more?
Все агентства имеют программы поддержки обучения детей. Мгм.
All the agencies have programs for support in terms of teaching, support of students and bringing them into the space industry. But when you look at the approaches, you can see that the approaches are rather mechanistic. Sometimes those programs work, but they don't always bring up enough interest. So together with the Utah State University, we started bringing school children to involve them into the experiments that we're doing on board. So perhaps we're performing an experiment on board the station, and the students are performing the same experiment on the ground. So this creates an effect of participation. We tell them what is the methodology for performing science experiments, and help them to feel like they're participating in the space experiments, and they create the sites and exchange information. And this program that has been tested in Russia, and it's been undertaken in Russia. We also brought in Japanese school children, and in order to select properly the young staff for subsequent work in the space research engineering, we needed to make sure that the children in school would feel this spirit of participating. And the virtual picture, it gives you some knowledge, but it may bore children fairly quickly. But when they're actually doing something in practice,
someone want to summarize the comments?
And may I just, as a follow-up comment on this, Dr. Sychov's few sentences. Dr. Sychov failed to mention that this effort never been funded. So it's his own personal enthusiasm. And if we had some funding available, easily available, not the bureaucratic hard way of it, then maybe it would be better success of it.
Yeah. Can you summarize? Knowledge
transfer.
Mm-hmm.
They've got scientists working. It's about knowledge transfer, and what they've got is they've got the old cadre actually doing the work with the young kids, enthusiastically transferring the knowledge they've got into the kids. Yeah. I think that's something that we need to do, and I'm sure that we brought that up in our group. Mm-hmm. But I think it needs to go throughout the whole system, actually.
Yeah.
We comment on the fact we want a knowledge-based society, but we don't reimburse teachers. And one of the interesting things is, over the last 5 years, I've noticed an increasing frequency with which I get asked the following question by students: how much do you make as an astronaut. So this fixation now on, if I become an astronaut, am I going to be able to make millions of dollars like if I'm a pro basketball player or rock star or whatever? So there's this very strong fixation on materialistic rewards. And if we're a knowledge-based society, isn't the reward knowledge and participating in the process of generating knowledge, leaving a legacy of knowledge? So it's very much a cultural phenomenon that I think we're facing. And as a parent, if you have a choice of sending your kid to a public school where the mean salary of a teacher is 35 grand and you're getting the corresponding level of competency, versus sending your kid to a private school where the teachers are reimbursed more and as such there's a much greater level of competency, what is probably the best solution? Unfortunately, that's not accessible to everybody. And I'll just finish by saying that one of the best educational experiments I've seen was on the Nemo 9 mission from a group of students in a private primary school here in Houston, where their biology teacher was a PhD biochemist that formerly worked at a pharmaceutical company and left all that because he really wanted to teach kids. And they had the most profound scientific experiment I've ever seen and got data that was actually meaningful to us in the conduct of our activities. So I just challenge all of us to think of the reality of how do we create a true knowledge-based society and fund the people that purvey the knowledge appropriately.
I think I've used up all the time that we have at Energy. So when I get elected president, we're going to Mars and we're going to be energy independent in 15 years. And your taxes are going up.
Well, as you can see, we could probably spend the rest of the day talking about that topic. It's one that is a real challenge. I would note, though, that there is a program that we have had going in this country that Sally Wright had gotten started called EarthCam, which involved students in primary schools actually participating in controlling cameras and doing experiments related to looking back at the Earth and Earth resources, and that's been going on. But unfortunately, the funding for it and the allocation of time by NASA has pretty much ended. So somehow we need to, when we get a program working successfully, we need to look at continuing the support and make sure that we realize that we're getting benefits that are important to the country. We'll go ahead and proceed with Chuck on the next group.
Good morning. I'd like to briefly call roll for my group so that everyone knows who participated. We had James Abbey, Oliver Anger, Charlie Bolden, Nicole Buckley, Jean-Marc Comtois, Volker Dahmen, Julie Doe, Neil Lane, Lorna Onizuka, Ashat Sarkeesian, Igor Savalyev, Walt Sipes, Jeffrey Sutton, and Vladimir Sishev. And I'm especially thankful to my good friend Ashat for pulling together these notes last night. And I only wished he'd used larger font, recognizing my liabilities. First, our topic was opportunities and challenges for international cooperative and collaborative activities. And after a round of introductions, I would say we had a very lively discussion, all participants engaged in. And we came up with what I will read you as a few general statements, and then we went around the table at the end of our discussion and asked each individual what they thought perhaps was the biggest opportunity or the biggest challenge that we faced in this area. And we tried to compile those, and those are a little tougher to go through. And as I kind of marked them up this morning, remember we were looking for both opportunities and challenges. Out of the 10 we listed, I had 1 opportunity and 9 challenges. So there's a lot of work to be done. But first, if I could go through these general statements. So we talked a lot about some of the very successful international cooperative activities in space medicine and life sciences that have proven very productive and beneficial for all parties involved. And we feel that we need to continue to identify and bring together nations and scientists in various cooperative frameworks because this is a very important and it is a realistic goal. I I think we spent a lot of time on the space medicine group because they have been the most mature of the working groups that we currently are working with here in this environment, and they have developed significant policies and procedures on how to select astronauts, care for them, and do it in a very cooperative manner. So it's quite a success. And the ISLSWG is somewhat similar. That is, pardon me for the acronym, International Space Life Sciences Working Group, which was actually formed by Ron White in the early 90s when he could see that as we got further into shuttle, there was this need to coordinate life sciences research activities. Also, we spoke of the U.S.-Russian Joint Working Group in Space Biology and Medicine, and the National Space Biomedical Research Institute as an excellent example of this valuable international cooperation. We see the need for a clear, scientifically substantiated, and internationally recognized space policy. That's a mouthful. But this has to be driven by current and foreseeable global demands and uphold the extreme importance of international space exploration and its use in defining priorities and goals. Strong initiatives in this direction should be brought forward to each government to try and encourage this. The scientific programs themselves must be selected, managed, and overseen in a way that hopefully engages the best and the brightest scientists and capitalizes on the unique capabilities and expertise available internationally. The resources are precious, both in time and monies invested by the cooperating parties, and they must be directed towards successful end results. The partnerships must not compromise on quality or caliber of science, and we encourage the very best proposals be selected for ISS and other programs to generate products that have unquestionable merit. Some examples that have been working on our side have been the Smart Medical Systems effort, development of advanced sensors, and other cutting-edge technologies as examples of products that work and are valuable for the future of human space exploration. We see trends evolving in the ISS program that bridge the gap between the areas of operational space medicine and biomedical sciences, but the progress is not sufficient. These trends must be strongly encouraged to continue sharing resources and increase the efficiency of crew activities. Collaborative, complementary approaches to life sciences and operations in space must become a common vision for all the agencies. Now, regarding some of the challenges and opportunities, one of these that was a real opportunity, as an example, outside of life sciences was the Hubble Telescope Institute, which has proven to be a very successful international activity. And of course, it wouldn't have happened at all without the shuttle program and the support of the program for all the efforts to maintain the Hubble telescope. We believe that we can get a consensus on scientific priorities across the programs, but these world leaders in science have to join together to make this happen, and that's part of the importance of the collaboration. An internationally recognized science policy, which we mentioned before, we think is necessary, and it has to be written such that it could be understood by people of all different backgrounds, locations in the world, and cultures. One example we talked about was the example of the political courage and leadership illustrated by Dr. Oleg Guzenko. And for those of you who don't know him, he was one of the early directors of the Institute of Biomedical Problems in Moscow. Dr. Guzenko, in a time when it was difficult in his own government, supported international collaboration throughout the Cold War. There were collaborations on biosatellites and activities that we are still engaged in at the present time, such as the Biocosmos missions. And the political stability of the countries involved and the continuity of their space policy is necessary to ensure reliable and successful partnerships. And one of the challenges we've had in the NASA side is Throughout different levels of management, many changes in the key people over the years, and this has broken up the continuity of these relationships at times. It's a real difficult challenge because in our society in particular, people tend to move on and move up and go out of the important responsibilities they might have had in maintaining these collaborations. We talked about, as has been mentioned by others this morning, the restricting effect of export control regulations and foreign policy approaches for these international collaborations can be severely impeded by these export restrictions on materials, biological samples, technologies. Space collaboration and cooperation is a well-demonstrated area of success in spite of some of these difficulties, but it could certainly be more successful if we could find a way to get around them. It was mentioned earlier, but Charlie Bolden brought it up, and this is one of our key issues, a challenge. It seems to us, anyway, in our group, that the current new program of going to the moon on the U.S. side is a rather unilateral approach. And the thought seems to be we'll offer to bring in the internationals as we can use them or need them. And this type of policy really isn't the kind of effort we want or need to encourage collaboration with all these countries. We know that building these relationships depends upon common goals, and it depends upon, we call it transparency of agendas of the parties involved. The relationship building is essential to attain mutual trust, respect, and rapport among the potential partners, and this takes a lot of time. It's not a simple issue. Another challenge was programmatic redirection and unilateral discussions or allocations of funding in the middle of a program. I believe ISS has suffered because of this. We started out with a pretty good idea of what the goals were, and suddenly we changed horses and we're wanting to go back to the moon. And therefore, there are many of us who worry about whether we're going to see ISS become the laboratory reality that we had all hoped it would be and accomplish the research we had all hoped would be done. Another challenge is some unsatisfactory channels of communication and limited availability of some appropriate counterparts and discussions. It makes it difficult to manage these interfaces between the partners. We really have to work to identify the best individuals who are at an appropriate level, and we said it doesn't have to be a top level, but a high enough level to have adequate authority to ensure that they can make the decisions when they go back to their agencies that will indeed support what the group had talked about. We also mentioned something that had been discussed earlier, the concern over when the shuttle is no longer flying. We have an extremely limited down mass capability for returning samples. It's a matter of a few kilograms coming down on each Soyuz. And I think Neil had a pretty good discussion about that. I don't need to go into that. He covered some very good points about how we're going to have to change the manner in which we do these studies, and we're going to have to get the information on orbit, and we're not going to be able to bring down the samples that we've always done in the past. Another point was, or another challenge is, different agencies or governments have different standards, specifications, and assumptions. And so to come together with a robust concept of operations and really an acceptable definition of human risk levels is a real challenge for a cooperative program involving people who come at this from varied backgrounds and differences in what is an appropriate risk. We also are concerned about the fact that we have a lack of, we call it generational continuity, or passing the information from the older to the younger generation. And NASA certainly recognized this for a long time because they have a bimodal population, and I'm on the far end of one of those modes. But I personally always tried to pass on the information as best I could to those working with me, and I think we all have to work very hard at that so that we don't have to repeat things, as Neil said, that we know. A couple of others, and I'll wrap this up. We were concerned about excessive, and this is a tough word, bureaucratization of a cooperative program, meaning simply so many rules, policies, documents, structures, and layers of hierarchy that it was difficult to make the decisions and know that they would be followed. So I know this is an impossible challenge, but it is an opportunity. If we can minimize the political aspects of the program and have a well-designed authority structure that will follow through and encourage strong public and scientific community support, we think the programs will be more successful. And I think I'd like to end at that point. Take any questions, any comments from members of our team, things I might not have covered? Well, to try and get us on schedule, I'll say thank you very much and sit down.
Well, we have one more group, and then Neil's panel. Is there any questions or any comments on the three groups that have been that you've heard from so far, other than the ones that we've been talking about, Neil?
Microphone. Oh, thank you. I wasn't going to make the comment because of the time constraints, but maybe there is time. On the education panel, I think Dr. Tour, who commented on the difficulty of getting federal agencies to support bold new ideas, is absolutely correct. Of course, there are exceptions, but on the whole, it's correct. I spent a lot of time at the National Science Foundation, and I have a lot of positive things to say about peer review. There's not a better mechanism to decide among projects what to fund in terms of excellence. But what peer review generally is not doing, at least in my country, is allowing us to fund some of the really bold, high-risk, low probability of success ideas. It's a fairly conservative system, and federal agencies, part of government, I think we can all understand, tend to be fairly conservative in their choices. So it's going to take, in addition to the very good ideas that I heard about what agencies might do and the educational establishment, it's going to take entrepreneurs stepping out, taking risks, and looking for support to, I think, make really big discoveries in education. It's probably true in other areas of science as well. So I just want to put in a pitch for that. On the point of the dropout rate in Houston, we had an event at the Baker Institute a couple of weeks ago in which some of our researchers rolled out a paper that has already been published, showing that in the Houston area, the dropout rate directly correlates with the way we evaluate schools. We teach to the tests, and if the school does not turn in a good test score, principal's likely to get fired, moved, school may get closed. It's totally inverted. It is not an intended consequence of our system in Texas, or I think the national approach, but right now it's broken because now the teachers are teaching only to the test, not to substance, not to content, and the kids are being kept back in the 9th grade twice, 3 times, 4 times until they drop out, so they don't have to take the test and bring down the score of the school. This is an unintended consequence of the current system. Very bad. I think it affects other states, and I'm hopeful that it will be changed. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Well,
well, I was on the panel that's missing right now, and one of the things we talked about introduces, I think, kind of a bigger elephant in the room. And as we were talking about, it was medicine and engineering problems, or opportunity, I guess I should say. And one of the things we talked about was the suits, for example, that NASA now has a requirement to design a spacesuit for a 1 to 99 percentile person. which is essentially saying for everybody has to be able to fit in that suit. And that, of course, has tremendous engineering and cost impacts on the program itself. And we're doing that at a time when we've got a program that's being funded at less than 20% of what it was back in its peak. Since there's no any real rational reason for that, and I noticed, the Russians have a much more sensible range of accommodation on their suits. Since there's no rational reason for it, it's obviously a political decision that was made. But we're supposed to be scientists here, and our job is to provide inputs to even politicians. Even politicians will sometimes listen to rational inputs, which then opens up the thoughts to other things. For example, I've been here 3 days now. I haven't heard any real airing of pluses and minuses of like mixed gender crews, probably because that is a fire that people don't want to touch. Or going even more broadly than that, we got a panel coming up on international cooperation and what have you. And all I hear is the pluses and the assumption that everything is going to be international from now on. Nobody ever wants to talk about the trade-offs that you make in order to do these. And I know there are some trade-offs. They may, in fact, not overweigh the fact that you get good cooperation. It probably has certain foreign policy advantages and what have you. But, for example, there's no doubt in my mind that international programs run slower than programs that are not international. They cost more, not less, in almost every case that I can possibly think of. It introduces things into crews as political considerations and things like that. All I'm saying is, if we're supposed to be a scientific group and we provide inputs to other people, we should not be unwilling to talk about the pluses and minuses and consider what trade-offs take place.
Thank you. Any other general comments that people would like to make before we get Neil's panel underway? I think what we'll probably do is do Group A after Neil's panel. So Neil, let me turn it over to you.